Thank you, and after that tremendous introduction and recognizing that I am just merely the warm-up act for our featured speaker, I promise to keep this brief. But this topic is one that is near and dear to my heart, one that I professionally have engaged in trying to make a slight difference in improving, but also just personally feel incredibly convicted to make sure Arlington is able to look at past history and create a different future. And the topic of today's Leckey Forum has caused me to sort of reflect on why I even sought public office in the first place. And, I'll admit, I'm an idealist, so I thought about pursuing public office, elected office, so that I could really engage in the public policy debates, so that I could really work towards growing opportunities and strengthening economic security while remediating some of the inequalities, the inequities that we've seen in our past. And then I also wanted to see that Arlington was a special place where we could leverage the public sector to really improve our community in innovative ways. I have not lost any of those ideals, but I also recognize that politics plays a huge role in what we are able to accomplish. Now, there's the dictionary definition of politics, where we can talk about it as the activities that we all engage in to resolve conflicts among people with different ideologies or who have different states that they represent. But there's another dimension of politics, and those are the considerations that we make in determining what we will pursue and how aggressively we will pursue it. And I bring all of this up because as we think about housing and the nexus between housing and inclusivity and increasing racial and socioeconomic diversity, the pursuit of effective public policies to achieve these outcomes is often thwarted by political considerations. But these considerations, in my opinion, are not immutable. They can change. Now, housing, as we all know, is incredibly important. It's one of the elements on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's at the base level of our physiological needs. And it also stands as a pillar for what many people consider to be a component of their quality of life. And for most Americans, it remains true still today that housing is the primary way for them to achieve financial security and also to transmit wealth to future generations. We can never dismiss or underestimate the primacy of housing in our country. But despite that primacy, there is a lack of widespread understanding of how public policies have contributed to the segregation of our neighborhoods and schools, as well as the lack of investments in communities of color, the suppression of political power for people of color. We saw that history relayed both on a national scale and also a local scale by the previous presentation. But taking a step back, as we look at sort of what caused that all to be, the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North, as minorities shifted to cities seeking greater opportunity, what they found in many circles was racial resistance. And they also found exploitation by people who could capitalize on the fact that you had a large number of people with limited options who could further be exploited by creating laws that restricted not only where they could be, but also confined the neighborhoods that they were in, creating few opportunities for them to buy, and mostly being in an endless cycle of renting, and not renting based on fair market value, but based on a market that was controlled by people who wanted to exploit the situation. Now, this period of our history has largely been repudiated. Thankfully, we have the Fair Housing Act. And even during the Obama administration, we doubled down and we have the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act. Our country has made it very clear that we reject those notions of the past. Those are, of course, good things. However, they are not sufficient to remediate the circumstances that they created. The very notion that we had neighborhoods that were not open to people of color, not open to people of various religions, it wasn't just a proverbial walling off, it was literal. We see it in Arlington with Halls Hill. We see it all across our country with highways that separate desirable neighborhoods from undesirable neighborhoods, railroad tracks, other infrastructure. And in those places that were literally walled off and separated, that's where industries that we thought would have a noxious and toxic effect on the community at large, that's where it was determined that it was appropriate for them to be placed. Unwanted industries, industries that could cause environmental concerns, these became the elements of infrastructure in many communities that were open to people of color. That is something that has not effectively been undone. And so, if we think about what are our chief barriers today to realizing an inclusive community through housing policy, I would posit that it's not really the lack of good ideas, it's not really the limited ability to think about tools that might be effective. I think we really have to look inward, and we have to look at ourselves and some of the things that are holding us back. The first that I'll posit is this whole idea that housing is too hard and it's subject to market forces. We are weak, we are powerless to go against this tide. While I do not want to underestimate that the market forces create a technical and a capital challenge, I do not find that these are insurmountable. What is insurmountable, however, is a belief that we are powerless in their wake, that we are simply pawns to these amorphous market concepts that have control of our lives. That is not in fact true. Another area that we have to really examine ourselves is how we actually go about the business of providing for the land use in our own communities. One area, zoning. The whole idea that we have one dwelling per lot, and we allow for the increasing footprints of the dwellings on said lots, absolutely factors into our affordability challenge. It restricts housing supply, and it increases the prices of housing on those parcels. Now, I recognize that many of those communities where that is the paradigm are lovely communities that people are extremely proud and happy to live in. And we certainly don't want to change in any way the notion that neighborhoods are for people, for families who want to grow and stay in Arlington for generations. However, that does not mean that our only way of looking at zoning in neighborhoods is to preserve something that actually contributes to our affordable housing and diversity challenge. There are other ways to think about it. And when our language becomes about, let's make sure we protect neighborhoods, what we have to acknowledge is that means preserving a level of unaffordability and segregation that exists. You don't have one without the other. And we can't kid ourselves into thinking we can have it both ways. To tout our progressive bona fides with housing and affordability while also accepting the framework that certain neighborhoods need to be protected. Ask ourselves, protected from what? And the corollary to that is also density. We think about density in many ways in Arlington, but often you hear we want to mitigate density. We want to concentrate density in certain areas. We want density to be something that we don't deal with. Well, again, if that's our framework and our paradigm, we are losing a key tool to deal with affordability. And look, I'm going to close up because I've just gotten time that I need to move on. I will say that for us, one of the reasons that I love this forum is because it allows us to break through that, to recognize that good ideas need to be explored, they need to be discussed, and then hopefully from here, they will be discussed in our community. And I remain optimistic because one of the things that I know to be true, I talk to a great many Arlingtonians, and what I hear as often as this idea that we need to protect our neighborhoods and mitigate density, I also hear that I want my neighborhood to be a place where I can interact with people from diverse backgrounds. I want my kids to go to schools where they interact with people from diverse communities and diverse life experiences. I think we need to hold people to that and engage them on those levels and then expose them to the tools that can actually make that a reality. So thank you very much, and I look forward to a terrific day.